Spanish influenza epidemic began in the spring of 1918. It occurred in 3 waves. The first was an outbreak that began in some training camps in Kansas and Georgia, spread to Europe. The second was in the fall of 1918, which was the most lethal. And the third was the fall of 1919.
As soldiers at the Western Front in Europe are starting to get ill with the flu, there are rules of military censorship that basically silence that so that most people in the home countries don't know about it. This is because they're afraid of letting the other side know that their soldiers are sick.
The great flu pandemic of 1918-1919 became known as the Spanish flu because the Spanish were neutral, so they didn't have the same censorship. They report about it in the newspapers in Spain, and people go, oh, look, there's a flu in Spain, must be a Spanish flu. And that's why we call it the Spanish flu. It has nothing to do with its origins.
It might seem like a coincidence that a global pandemic of influenza happens at the same time as the First World War. But in fact, they're related. This is a time when you have tons of people living in close quarters together, particularly those who are serving in the military. You have shortages of food and good housing that mean that people are just not as healthy as they might otherwise be. And you have millions of people moving back and forth across their own countries, across the Atlantic. This is a perfect storm for the explosion of the flu into a global crisis.
By the end of October 1918, people were tired of the restrictions.
David Bristow of History Nebraska says once cases and deaths started dropping, restrictions were lifted on November 1st, as long as people followed social distancing and places like theaters were not running at full capacity.
But immediately the theaters were full and people were going out to restaurants and people started behaving as if everything was back to normal. And then there was a big celebration on November 11th for Armistice Day, the end of World War I. And the cases started going up again.
After cases and deaths spiked, local health commissioner E.T. Manning considered restrictions once again.
Once you have loosened the restrictions, you have a very hard time psychologically trying to get people to accept them again.
Mary Lyons Carmona with the history department at UNO says Manning faced political fallout from that idea and therefore chose not to put restrictions back in place.
None of the politicians wanted to be the bad guys and say, nope, we have to go back.
One thing that did change was ordinances passed in January that fined people $15 to $100 who left their homes during quarantine.
$15 doesn't sound like much in today's money, but that would be a considerable threat for somebody in 1918.
Both historians agree when places open up, capacity rules need to be enforced. Social distancing is a must, and things like masks, which were frowned upon back in 1918, are still necessary.
I don't remember learning much about the Spanish influenza in history class. It's something that's glossed over, but it's obviously very important. When the Spanish flu lasted was from, according to Google, February of 1918 to April of 1920. It infected 500 million people. It says deaths are anywhere from 17 to 100 million. That's a big estimate. How they say it ended, this is according to the Washington Post, is over time, those who contracted the virus developed an immunity to the novel strand of influenza, and life returned to normal by the early 1920s. They say that people got immune or died. When did the COVID-19 pandemic start? They're saying the pandemic started on December 31st, 2019. January 30th, 2020, the WHO declared it an outbreak and a global health emergency. So it's been a year and 2 months. Based on the Spanish flu, it seems like if it follows the same pattern, we have about another year left. That depends on, everything. It's a different virus, so who knows? COVID cases today, unfortunately, went up by quite a bit. They're above 100,000. They were 105,600 new cases in the US. I hope they drop. Thank you so much for watching. Comment, like, subscribe.